Hello, and welcome to your Nexania training video on how to do expense reporting here with Nexania. So, with Nexania, you can create your expense reports through any major web browser, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer 9 and up. These all allow you to log into Nexania using your email address and your password, and access the system to create expense reports. Now, in a separate training video, we're also going to cover how you can use Nexania's mobile applications to create your expense reports on your smartphones or tablets or other mobile devices. We're going to start here on the web. Here I am logged in as Tom. So Tom is logged in with his email address and password and is now logged into Nexania. At the top of the menu, we see the tab for expenses. Clicking it will take you to your expenses homepage. Under the expenses homepage, this is where you're going to view any expense reports you saved in Nexania or created here. Every expense report for the next 7 years will be available for you here on Nexania. So let's create an expense report. An expense report will act like a folder or a container for all the expenses that go into it. You could have one expense report that lasts you the entire month or the entire week, or you can create separate expense reports for specific events or specific conferences or projects that you're working on. It's whatever your preference is for organizing those expenses. So, for example, to create an expense report, we click Add Report, the green button right here. Let me name our report. Let's say, for example, this is our report for expenses for training, and save. Great, so there's our expense report. So let me just hit close here to show you. We can see our expense report at the top of the list here. Every time you create an expense report, the system will create a number for it, a unique identifying code for that report with Search for Common Ground. No two people will have that same number on their expense report. So let's add some expenses into this expense report, number 1024. Let's click on that code, open it up, and add some expenses in. Now, when you need to create an expense, just click Add Expense Item. Here we are creating our expense item. On the right side of the menu, that's where we're going to be attaching the receipt for the expense. On the left side, this is where we're going to be entering the details for the expense. The first field you have, SFCG. This represents the different entities of the organization that you have. So for example, we're an entity E. The next field you fill out would be your grant. Now, the list of grant codes is listed here. You could always search for it if you know exactly which grant code you're looking for. Say, for example, look for DFD. Otherwise, you just scroll through the menu and make your selection. So let's choose DFD. There we go. Now, the last bit we fill in here is our category. The category is basically you saying, what type of expense is this? Now, depending which grant code you choose, you may see a different list of values appear here under the categories. So whatever grant you're choosing, you'll see the categories that apply or are available to use under that particular category. So in this case, let's say we're working with a category called training. All right. So in this case, again, I'm just going to type in train. So it's a little easier for me to find. Let's say trainers at 100% assistant. There we go. Date, well, that's going to represent the date of the transaction in this case. So let's say, for example, this was from the 22nd. Okay. Now, the next field here, receipt, that's whether you have a receipt for this expense or not. If you have a receipt, switch it to yes. If you don't, hit no. In my example, I'll pretend I had a receipt for this. So say yes. Lastly is the total. This is where you put in the amount of the expense. So let's say it was $800 US. Now, the currency that you see here, that'll be the currency that you typically get reimbursed in. I'll show some examples using other currencies in a few moments, but basically that'll be the currency that you get reimbursed in. It's all going to be set for you automatically. Now, lastly, you have the memo field. This is a space provided to you to provide so you can add more notes to the expense, Ex explaining the expense, talking about what was purchased, for example. You got as much detail as you need in there. That's going to be visible to yourselves, administrators, and approvers. Great. Now, I'm not going to add a receipt quite yet. I'm going to hit save and close here because I want to teach you how to read an expense item in the expense report right now. So this is expense item number 1 in the expense report for the $800. To the left of the date are some symbols that appear. I'll review what these mean in just a moment, but if you ever need it, back here under your home page, let me just hit close. Top right corner where your name is a drop-down menu. Third value from the top is an icon legend, just explaining all the different things you may encounter and what they mean. Now in this expense, to the left of the date, you'll see a check mark under which you'll see the status of your expense item. Every item has a status. 3 dots in yellow means this item is in draft mode. It's a work in progress. You're still able to edit it, change it, adjust it as necessary. It's still yours to work on. Only once we submit the expense in will that be locked down and passed forward to our approver. Now, on the left side, we've triggered a submit blocker. This appears if there's some reason preventing us from submitting the expense. It could be that we're missing receipts, we forgot to fill something in, whatever, or we broke a rule on the expense. Whatever the reason is, you can click on it. The system will let you know what the reason is and how to fix it. And in fact, that's what the paperclip indicates. It's red because we're missing the receipt here. So let's add one in. So here we are completing the expense by adding a receipt to it. I'll be covering a variety of ways of adding receipts into expense reports in a few moments, but let's say that we're going to upload a receipt that we've got saved on our computer. Could be something you've downloaded or something that you've scanned to your computer, for example. So we click Add Receipts, we click Upload, and then we're going to choose a file sitting on our computer. That file could be in JPEG format, PNG, GIF, TIFF, or PDF documents. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, no worries. They're easily the most common image formats. So you just choose your receipt, hit Open, and hit OK, and that'll upload this receipt into the expense report and into the expense item. Now, this receipt is now linked to this expense. Linked is a key term in Nixonia. Linked means that that receipt is now proof for that expense. When the approver reviews that expense, this is the receipt they're going to be looking at. So we just hit Save and Close, and there's our completed expense. The submit blocker disappeared, a receipt indicator turned green. In theory, that's an expense that I'd be allowed to submit in for approval now if I wanted to. And of course, I can add more expenses into this report before I choose to submit it as well. Now, you're also able to create expenses and then use a receipt that you've already stored in the expense report from before. To use one of those receipts, just click Add Expense Item. And again, we're going to create our expense. So make sure we've got our entity set. It'll remember it from last time as well, including it'll also remember the grant. So if it's the same grant, leave it alone. If it's a different grant, choose that from the drop-down menu. And again, choose your category for the expense. Let's say you know what the code this expense is for. Let's say it was 432, for example. 343. Let's use that one as an example. Great. So we indicate the date of the purchase. Let's say this was on the 20th. Yes, we have a receipt for it. Put our amount in. Okay. Notes about the expense. Now, in this case, to use a receipt that we've stored in the expense report, maybe it's something you emailed in, which I'll demonstrate shortly, or maybe it's something you've stored in the expense report from before, use the filter in the middle of the expense item. Here where it says not linked, now I can access the 3 receipts I've stored in the expense report for later. So now I can choose the receipt I want by clicking it and hitting link to connect them. Hit save and close, and it's complete. Now for our last example here, let's say that we have an expense we've incurred in a foreign currency, something other than what we get reimbursed in. All right, so we'll add an expense item. Now when we add the expense item in, again, remember, it's going to remember the last entity and grant that we used. So if it's the correct one, great. If not, make sure you reset it. Then you choose your category. Let's say this was some office supplies that we had to pick up. All right, so let's say, there we go. We'll say it's office supplies in Goma, for example. Great, and we'll say we paid for those on the 21st. Yes, we have a receipt for it. And let's say this cost us $25. $25. Now, this employee is getting reimbursed in US currency, but what if this expense was in another currency? Other currencies are available through you through the drop-down menu. Administrators can add other currencies if you do need them. Let's say, for example, this was in euros. Then you choose euros. This was in 25 euros. It's converted back to my reimbursed currency. The exchange rate you see here is brought in from an online source and is date-based. Basically, it's the same rate that the banks receive. So if you say, for example, that was actually from January the 6th, it'll change the rate reflecting the exact date of the transaction. Now, for some reason, there's a variance or a difference between the exchange rate that's here on the screen and the one that you paid. You are able to indicate and adjust that rate within a 5% margin. That way you can get reimbursed accurately for any foreign currency transactions. Just attach a receipt. Let's use this one here on the screen. Hit link and save and close. There's our expense converted back into our reimbursed currency. And that's how you handle currency conversions here on the system. So let's talk about ways you have of adding receipts to expenses. Let's open up this report right here. So when we create an expense item, you have a couple of ways of adding a receipt into it. As we reviewed, if you want to use a receipt you emailed or stored in the expense report, use this filter in the middle to find that receipt. For example, if I hit not linked, then I can find the one receipt not linked to any expenses. If I hit not linked to this item, now I can find all the receipts in my expense report. Now, another common way of adding receipts to an expense you're creating right now is to use your webcam on your desktop or laptop computer to photograph the receipt and add it in. This works just fine with Mozilla Firefox and Google's Chrome browser. Unfortunately, this will not work with Internet Explorer and Safari. Those browsers don't allow the webcam to communicate with the application. But if you're like me and you're using Chrome, for example, you can turn on your webcam. There's our camera. So it allows me to photograph my receipt, snap my photo, and there we go. Now all I need to do is crop out anything else I don't need from that photo. There we are. Hit OK. And there's my receipt added to the expense. So the webcam is a really easy way, if you're at your computer right now, to simply photograph a receipt, crop it, and attach it to your expense. Just need to add in the rest of your details. There we go. Put our memo information in there and save it. So let's talk about some ways you have of storing receipts in an expense report for later. As I mentioned, you can email receipts in or you can store receipts in your expense report that you intend to use later on. Let's use our expenses for Mission Goma here as an example. Let's say you want to store some receipts in the expense report that you're going to use a little later. This is where we're going to use the Manage Receipt button. Under Manage Receipt, that's where you're going to find any receipts that you've stored in the expense report, whether you've used them on an expense or you're storing them for later. So for example, I could add some more receipts in here that I intend to use. So I can hit Upload. I could add a couple of receipts in here. Let's grab that receipt there. Let's grab another one. Let's also grab a PDF document. PDF documents are really common in expenses. They're multi-page documents that are either emailed to you or maybe you scanned a large number of receipts together. This is a 5-page PDF here. With a PDF document, the system will take a moment to divide each of the pages up into its own receipt page. Takes just a few moments, depending on the size of the document and your internet connection, of course. But otherwise, there's all the receipts stored in our expense report now, ready for us to use. Now, as well, you can, of course, email receipts into your account and use them later on. So there's our email option. If you click it, you'll see all the instructions about how to email receipts in, but let me explain how to do this. You're going to email your receipts in to receipts@nexania.com. It's just one address to remember. Now, you're going to either send them in as either image attachments attached to that email, or you could forward us an email. For example, you could, if you bought something online and they emailed your receipt, Just forward that email to receipts@nixani.com. We'll add it into your expense report again within about 5 minutes, and they'll be available for you to use. Now, as I said, we're going to email this when you email receipts in, you'll always get a confirmation email back from us confirming we've received the receipts within 5 minutes. So how do we know which account, which profile to send those receipts to? So the email address which you're using to log into Nixania with is already attached to your account. It's already registered on your account. So that's how we know where to place any receipts sent from that address. But what if you have another email address you wish to send from? Your Hotmail address, your Gmail address, whatever address you wish to add from. Well, all you need to do is register it on your account, and it's easy to do. Top right corner here where your name is, click it. There's a drop-down menu with your account settings. These are where you can go to set any of your personal account preferences for how you see the information on the screen. But as well, you also have a tab here called linked email addresses, where you can go in to register any additional email addresses you wish to add to your account. Hotmail addresses, Gmail address, any addresses you wish to add. Just type them in, hit add. We'll send an email to that address that you have to confirm, and then once you've done that, anytime you email us from that address, we'll know those receipts belong to that account. Now, the last thing is, how do you steer the receipts into specific reports? So by default, if you email receipts in, we're going to add them into your newest expense report. But sometimes you want to direct the receipts into a specific expense report. That's not a problem at all. The key will be when you write your email, if you need to steer it into a specific expense report, in the subject line, type in the 4 or 5-digit report code of the expense report you want to send those receipts to. Just type it in there, hit send. That'll steer any receipts you've attached here into that specific report. Now, the last method you have of adding receipts, let me just demonstrate that right now. You can, of course, take photos of the receipts with your webcam as well here and store them in the expense report for later. And if you choose to, by clicking fax, it'll create a fax cover page if you choose to fax receipts in. Again, just put your receipts behind this cover page, fax them in. You can use this cover page as many times as you need to. Once you've done that, you can use these receipts in your expenses. So there's two ways to use these receipts. Let me show you a couple of options here. Now, there under Manage Receipts, we see we have 7 receipts available to us. To use a receipt, well, there's 2 methods. Add expense item in this case, and what we're going to do is bring in a receipt that we've used already. You may have seen this method already. So you create your expense. To use a receipt, use a receipt filter. Say, for example, not linked. Now we can access all the receipts we emailed in or uploaded or saved in there. We can choose that receipt, hit link, and save and close. There's our expense, and we've added a receipt we stored in the expense report. Now you can also take a receipt you've stored and build an expense out of it, go in the other direction. If we go here to manage receipts, there's all our receipts available to us. Now, first of all, how do you tell which receipts you've used and which ones you need to use? Any receipts you need to any receipts that you've used already will have a number at the top indicating which expense item it was connected to. Any receipts waiting to be used, they get pushed to the bottom of the menu and have no numbers on them whatsoever. And you have a filter here if you want to look at only the unlinked receipts. To use a receipt, just select it. There it is in the viewer. Hit the link button. That'll pull that receipt in, and now you can do a few different things with it. You could connect it or link it to an expense you've drafted or created in your expense report by checking the item off and hitting link. That'll connect the 2 items. As well, if you want to build a whole new expense out of it, just hit link to new item. Then code your expense. All right, let's say that, for example, this was for Visa costs. Let's say that cost us 203. Add your notes in and save and close. And there we've created item number 2 in our expense report with the receipt attached now. So those are the different ways of using receipts from the expenses. The last example I want to show here is what if you have multiple receipts you want to attach to a single expense? Say you emailed in a hotel bill or airfare or a multi-page bill, and you want to create one expense for that for with all those receipts attached to it. The easiest way is to go into Manage Receipts. Let's say this is for a bill that we emailed in, for example. So let's say it's these 3 pages at the bottom here. They're all for the same expense. Great. 1, 2, and 3. We've checked off those 3 receipts. Scrolling up, there's our link selected button, which you can click on, and it'll pull those 3 receipts in. And now I can either connect them all to the same expense or build a whole new expense item out of it. In this case, let's link up all 3 receipts to the same expense item and hit link. And now they're all connected to item number 2. So let's talk about how to correct mistakes. What if you make a mistake and you need to move a receipt, for example? Let's say you emailed receipts in and they've landed in the wrong expense report. To move a receipt, simply select it, scrolling up, and there's our Move Selected button. Clicking it allows you to shift the receipt to a different expense report you have available. So I can say I want to move this to report 1024 for training, hit move. There's our receipts out of this report, and they've been added into our training expense report. So you are able to move receipts between expense reports. The main rule with that, though, is the receipt cannot be linked to an expense when you want to move it. It has to be a free receipt. So for example, if I try to move this automobile receipt here, which I've checked off, I can't. This item is already linked. This receipt is already linked up to item number 1. In fact, I don't even have a move button available because this receipt is already spoken for. So keep that in mind. You can only move a receipt provided it's not attached to any expenses. Now, our other example of a mistake is, what if you need to delete an expense? You realize you claimed it already, you simply made a mistake, and you need to remove it from your report. To do that, let's take our expense item here. As long as it's in draft mode, you are able to still edit it, change it, or delete it. So for example, under Actions, there's our delete option. Now, if we hit delete, it will delete this expense item from the report. There's no undo button there, so make sure you're sure before you delete it. But just in case, you're not going to lose the receipt. If you have a receipt attached to that expense and you delete that expense, the receipt will still be saved for you here under the Manage Receipt button. So there's no risk you're going to lose that receipt. That's the basics of expenses and receipt management here on Nexonia. Now, to conclude, once you're ready to submit your expenses in for approval, all you need to do is open up your expense report and hit submit. When the items are in draft mode here, they have not been sent to the approver yet. So to make sure that you've signed off on it, pass it on to the approver, you need to hit the submit button. When you submit, you'll see the name of the approver who it's currently sitting with there with the blue arrows on there. You'll see the name of the approver it's currently sitting with to the right. The approvers will review the expenses and they'll be able to approve or reject them. Let's open up this expense report to demonstrate. If an expense was rejected, you'll receive an email and you'll see the expense now with the red arrow for rejected on it. If it's rejected, you can then go into that expense and now correct it. You could fix it and then resubmit it. A rejection is not refusal of reimbursement. It just means there may be something you need to fix on the expense. Now, the reason for the correction will be in the email as well. You can also click on the status icon here on the web. It'll let you know what the reason for the rejection was and who rejected it and how to fix it. If an expense is approved, then you'll see green check marks on any approved items. At that point, the expense has been fully approved, locked in, and is now approved to be reimbursed. Again, if you click on these status icons, you can see the history of every item, including who approved it and any feedback they gave you as well. So that's expenses here on the web.